Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maria LaMonaca Wisdom, and I'm the Director of Graduate Student Advising and Engagement for the Humanities at Duke University. Welcome to the opening conversation of Next Ed Fest 2018, sponsored by Duke Learning Innovation. Next Ed is an annual series of events exploring innovative ways we can find solutions to major challenges facing higher education. This week's challenge, the first of 4, is integrating the humanities and STEM in higher education. What does the integration of humanities and STEM look like? How can humanities and STEM collaborations be integrated into the curriculum and co-curriculum? And how can we further encourage students, both undergraduates and graduates, to participate in Duke's interdisciplinary culture? To anchor our conversation, we will be referencing a 2018 report by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine titled Integration of the Humanities, Arts, and Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in Higher Education, Branches of the Same Tree. One of our panelists, Dr. Pamela Jennings, served on the report committee and will discuss her engagements with it today. If you've not had time, can I just pick up the, if you've not had time to read all 200 pages of the report, isn't this beautiful? Do not fear. We'll touch upon broad themes and recommendations in this conversation, and perhaps it may whet your appetite for learning more. And it is posted online, and it's very easily accessible. I'll introduce our 3 panelists, but I'm going to go ahead and do it sequentially. Dr. Jennings will speak first. So I'll go ahead and introduce Pamela first. This is an informal conversation, hopefully lots of Q&A and audience engagement. But each of our panelists will take maybe about 10 minutes talking about their respective encounters with pedagogical innovation in humanities and STEM, and then we'll just turn things over for a general conversation. As you know, this is a really broad and rich topic, and we hope that you'll guide the conversation based on what interests you. So first we have Dr. Pamela L. Jennings. Pamela is professor and head of the Department of Art and Design at North Carolina State University. She received her PhD in Human-Centered Systems Design from the Center for Advanced Inquiry in the Integrative Arts at the University of Plymouth, and she also holds an MFA in Computer Art and a Master's in Business Administration. Pamela's technology research and innovations are rooted in her creative works in media, from photography, video and sound art, to interactive art, physical computing, and augmented reality. Her creative works are discussed in several books, including Creating Their Own Image, The History of African American University Artists, and Struggles for Representation, African American Film, Video, New Media Makers. She has presented her creative work at computer-human interaction conferences across the globe and at international exhibitions from Science World in Vancouver to the Kiasma Museum in Helsinki. Among her many leadership and research roles in academia and beyond, she has served as a National Science Foundation Program Officer in the Computer and Information Science and Engineering Directorate, and worked as design researcher in Silicon Valley on human-centered computing projects and educational technology. She is currently lead designer of Constructs, a new platform for learning that merges physical manipulatives with augmented reality for spatial cognition skills development through model building. While a faculty member with a joint appointment in the School of Art and the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon University, she developed an integrated curriculum that blended learning across digital media arts, design, computer science, physical and human-centered computing. So Pamela, I'm just so thrilled to be with us today, so thank you.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here at Duke University in Durham, just down the highway from Raleigh, my new home. Let me turn this on. Okay. There we go. Okay. Hopefully this is more for the video than necessary for you to hear me here, but let me know if it's too loud or if it's, okay. So I like to think about one of my early experiences in learning that set the stage for my integrative approach in creative practice, technology research, policy advisement, and leadership opportunities. So this is the story of my introduction to fuzzy logic and other forms of qualitative algorithmic technologies as an engine for speculative, aesthetic, new media, or digital art, digital media art, or the many terms that we use. to define the field. It was my first academic job interview at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute for a junior faculty position in the Department of Art in the early 1990s. At that time, I was naturally integrating my love of the image with computer code and a form of making with electronics that we called physical computing, as well as multimedia. I was given a tour during the campus visit that included the mechanical engineering lab. The students were learning about a control system with a seminal inverse pendulum exercise, that being the upside-down pendulum that's on a moving railed cart. The students had to write code that would keep the pendulum in an upright position as the cart moved. In other words, they were using fuzzy logic. The first experience seeing fuzzy logic in action was at the same time that I was building my MFA thesis project at the School of Visual Arts in the Computer Arts program. That work was titled The Book of Ruins and Desire, my first foray into system design for an interactive sculpture based on creative book arts. I wanted to figure out a subtle and responsive system to trigger various visual, moving image, and algorithmically produced music based on the turning of the page, like object that I was building that was made out of photo etching plates from printmaking, as well as sensors. And the inverse pendulum fuzzy logic was the answer. As a graduate student in computer arts, I built an interactive system based on the foundations of mechanical engineering. I can only imagine how much further I could have taken the concept if I had the opportunity to study mechanical engineering alongside my studies in the computer arts, aesthetics, and interactivity. So I did not get that job at RPI, but the work I did on the Book of Ruins and Desire opened the door to being recruited for positions at IBM Almaden Research Center in San Jose, California, and subsequent opportunities at SRI International, and as a professor of art and human-computer interaction at Carnegie Mellon University, leading to a stint as a rotator at the National Science Foundation to lead the Creative IT program and becoming an international champion of integrative research and creative practice as a form of progressive scholarship. The Creative IT program was around for about 4 years. There was a little bit of pre-work before that. In particular, what Creative IT did was to fund research in the Computer Science Directorate that integrated creative process, creative theory, and creative cognition with computer science and engineering, both from research to education initiatives to creative initiatives that were integrating basically those fields. So, the National Academies of Sciences report that has a very long name, the integration of the humanities and arts with science, engineering, and medicine and higher education branches of the same tree. We like to say arts and humanities integrated with STEM with 2 M's because we're including medicine in that as well. It was a 2-year consensus study report of a an amazing panel of experts from across the country that was chaired by David Skorton, who is the secretary of the Smithsonian Institute. The committee representation included research universities, community colleges, liberal arts and special initiative schools and higher education, the Association for American Colleges and Universities representatives, including their president, industry leadership, and academic disciplines that range from engineering, chemistry, and biology to the fine and applied arts and design, history, science, technology studies, women's studies, and medicine. So if you've taken a look at the report or you have the opportunity, we reference often this metaphor of Einstein's tree. The Einstein quote that opens the report suggests that a tree and its branches serve as a metaphor for thinking about the integration of arts, engineering, humanities, mathematics, medicine, science, and technology, because the vitality of the whole depends on the combined force of the parts. The trunk of the tree represents the core strength of the disciplines in higher education, the centralized force that directs students through the course of academic study. Yet the branches, where Einstein located religion, arts, and sciences, could also be seen as a location for integration as they move away from the trunk, yet remain integrally connected to the core strengths of the whole. Most importantly, the branches create opportunities for trees to connect to each other. In a forest, the canopy of intersecting branches connects distinct units. In this metaphor, it is the connections between the branches and the trunk and its roots, rather than the singular strength of any one part, that makes the tree healthy and viable. So specifically, the committee for the report was charged with the following: examining the evidence behind the assertion that educational programs that mutually integrate learning experiences in the humanities and arts with science, technology, engineering, math, and medicine, or STEM with 2 M's, lead to improved educational and career outcomes for undergraduate and graduate students. The committee recognized that the goal of liberal education was to impress upon students that all forms of human knowledge and inquiry are branches from the same tree. The liberal approach to education has evolved to systems where students are exposed to a broad array of disciplines through general education programs to address administrative structures that are fragmented among disciplinary lines. However, the question remains whether the education we are offering students today encourages the appreciation of the connections between and across disciplines. This has led to a calling, if not urge, to return to a more integrative approach to education. So assessing student learning outcomes across the breadth of American higher education is a daunting task. Confounded by a number and types of institutions that we looked at, the broadly varying backgrounds of the students matriculating, and importantly, the fact that curricular decisions are appropriately in the hands of local faculty members, not subject to any broad national consensus, except in the case of accreditation of specific disciplines. For these reasons, as well as the lack of agreement on the most effective ways to assess student learning outcomes, we found that large, controlled, randomized testing of the hypothesis that integrated education would lead to educational and employment benefits are rare, and they're likely to remain so. Nonetheless, we found abundant narrative and anecdotal evidence. Some evidence from research studies, and very importantly, a broad national groundswell of interest in developing approaches to integrated education. After considering multiple forms of evidence, the committee found that certain approaches to the integration of arts and humanities with science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine, STEM with 2 M's, are associated with positive student learning outcomes, including, but not limited to, written and oral communication skills, teamwork skills, ethical decision-making, critical thinking and deeper learning, content mastery, general engagement and enjoyment of learning, empathy, resilience, the ability to apply knowledge in real-world settings, and indicators of improved science literacy. Keep in mind, this is a study of the National Academy of Sciences, not the National Endowment of the Arts or Humanities, and so our focus here is always looking toward the sciences. Given that the available evidence is promising and indicates positive outcomes for students, the committee is urging a new nationwide effort to develop and fund the research agenda needed to collect the robust and multifaceted evidence that the broader educational community can accept, embrace, and apply to specific settings throughout the huge and complex landscape of American higher education. Though more research on the impact of integrated courses and programs is needed, the committee does believe is practical for institutions of higher education. The committee, does not believe that it is practical for institutions of higher education to wait to support and adopt integrative models. Rather, we recommend that institutions that view an integrative approach as potentially beneficial for the students move forward with the adoption of integrative courses and programs and evaluate them. Our report came up with 16 recommendations near the end of the report, of which 5 I will explain or mention here. The first one, professional, artistic, humanistic, scientific, and engineering societies should work together to build, document, and study integrative pilot programs and models to support student learning and innovative scholarship at the intersection of the disciplines. The next recommendation, institutions and employers should collaborate to better understand how graduates who participated in courses and programs that integrate the humanities and arts with science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine fare in the workplace throughout their career. The next recommendation, stakeholders such as faculty, administrators, and scholars of higher education research should employ multiple forms of inquiry and evaluation when assessing courses and programs that integrate the humanities, arts, natural sciences, social sciences, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medical disciplines, and including qualitative, quantitative, expert opinion, and portfolio-based evidence. Stakeholders should also consider developing new evaluation methodologies for integrative courses and programs. The next recommendation, when implementing integrative curricula, faculty, administrators, and accrediting bodies need to explore, identify, and mitigate constraints, such as tenure and promotion criteria, institutional budget models, workloads, accreditation, and funding sources that hinder integrative efforts in higher education. And the final recommendation that I will mention here today is that academic thought leaders working to facilitate integrative curricular models should initiate conversations with key accrediting organizations for STEM, the arts, and higher education to ensure that disciplinary structures and mandates imposed by the accreditation processes do not thwart efforts to move toward more integrative program offerings. So just to conclude, as Einstein noted, a tree and its branches serve as a metaphor for thinking about the integration of arts, engineering, humanities, mathematics, medicine, science, and technology. Because the vitality of the whole depends on the combined force of its parts. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Pamela. And next, we'll hear from Paul Bendich. Paul Bendich is Associate Research Professor in the Mathematics Department at Duke University, as well as the Associate Director for Undergraduate Research and Curricular Engagement at the Information Initiative at Duke. He also serves as Chief Scientist for Geometric Data Analytics, a local research and development company. Paul received his PhD in mathematics from Duke and a BA in physics from Grinnell College. The aim of Paul's current research is to develop algebraic, topological, and geometric tools for application in a wide variety of scientific areas, particularly the analysis of complex and high-dimensional data sets, and to find useful connections between topology, geometry, machine learning, and statistics. At the Information Initiative at Duke, he directs several award-winning programs that aim to foster data-driven, interdisciplinary undergraduate research and graduate student curricular engagement across and beyond the university, including Data Plus and Data Expeditions. Data Plus is a 10-week summer research experience in which undergraduate student research teams collaborate in learning how to marshal, analyze, and visualize data. Data Expeditions supports pedagogical collaborations between graduate students and faculty in order to introduce undergraduates to exploratory data analysis.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay, so I'm going to talk mainly about some things stemming out of my experience with Data Plus, and let me sort of give the structure of the remarks. So I think there are a lot of very interesting topics I'm not going to cover. So for example, the right way to really integrate STEM and humanities in the classroom, the right way to think about in career trajectories, and so on. I'm going to take the privilege of doing essentially talk about what happens in a summer research program, and essentially say a few data-driven observations of these are 3 or 4 or 5 projects we've run, and kind of say what I've learned from that and what sort of speculative models I think I know for what I think is true, and then what we've assessed, what we've not assessed, and in some sense I take very much your point that not much is assessed, how one might assess it as we go. I want to begin with some very, very strong caveats. So for one thing, I should give a large amount of credit to Astrid Juni, who's an instructor in the English department, who's essentially the conduit of a lot of humanities-oriented Data Plus projects. I work with her very heavily, and almost all of this in some sense is her work. The other caveat I want to give is that in many ways, I have the astonishing privilege of having 40 hours a week of students' time for 10 weeks, where it's the only thing they do. They are students at an elite university. Even if they don't have quote-unquote technical majors, which is maybe a skill I don't like, a term I don't like, they also have a lot of technical training. They're highly motivated, and we pay them a living wage. So we pay them $5,000 for the summer, which works out to be about high $13 per hour. So in some sense, that's the space I'm in, and that's the observations I'm giving, and so I'm very hesitant about universalizing that beyond there. I should maybe start my timer to make sure I don't talk too long. Cool. Okay, so let me just start so this past summer, so what Data Plus is every summer for 10 weeks, we have 24 or 25 teams, 2 or 3 students per team mentored by a project manager who's usually a PhD student, sometimes a postdoc. They have a data science problem, and what they're sort of mimicking is that it's meant to look like data analytics for a client. Sometimes that client is actually a corporation, sometimes that client is a city agency, sometimes that client is university faculty. But it's not the university faculty's core research. It's more like they're exploring a question, they're showing them what's possible, they're consulting, they're thinking about how to go more from there. And because that sort of work is incredibly hard, they have a community of people they work with. So it's not just them, but it's the other 24 teams. They're all in Gross Hall. We essentially lock them in the building for 10 weeks and they work. So 3 of those projects, I would say, this summer were very, very humanities focused. Just to give a quick blurb of them. So one of them, Astrid Juni, was actually the faculty client, and Nora Nunn was her PhD project manager. They essentially looked at the evolution of ways that presidential speeches use the word poverty. So the data set they looked at was a huge number of transcripts of presidential speeches and videos of presidential speeches. And they essentially were trying to find automatic ways to essentially track what was meant by poverty. And that was very interesting. Interesting as a question. Also involved a lot of sort of buzzword technical skills. Topic modeling, machine learning, image analysis, mapping, things like that. That was very cool. Another project, which was called Women's Spaces, was Professor Charlotte Sussman, and her PhD project manager was Michelle Soroka. What they did is they looked at a large number of magazines, many of them coded as women's magazines, Cosmopolitan, Essence, 17, and then a control group of ones that weren't coded as women's magazines. And they were essentially trying to come up with ways of understanding what messages were being said, what was being projected, and doing it over time. And again, on the technical end, that was topic modeling. That was something called optical character recognition, which is you have these really glossy magazines from the university library. How do you pull that into something that can actually be analyzed? The third project, which we called Pirate Narratives, was with also Charlotte Sussman, but a grad student, Grant Glass from UNC, where they looked at the extraordinarily large number of editions of Robinson Crusoe and various versions of that, did a sort of mapping, try an interactive way of mapping where they might have been published in various parts of the world, actually mapping the trajectory that Robinson took in different one of them, and again, topic modeling is pulling up themes, trying to figure out who is, maybe plagiarizing is the wrong term, who is plagiarizing from who is adapting from who, how the memes were changing as they went. And so those were really fascinating to watch from my perspective, and it was also fascinating to see how they work together. So some observations that came out of that. That's in some sense the data I'm drawing from. Some observations that come out of that, which I think are true, maybe, are, at least from my perspective, a question I really don't want to think about myself because it's way above my pay grade, is I don't want to think what's the right trajectory for a student who wants to do humanities in STEM. Should they be a math major or engineer and then get humanities as a finishing school, to say it vulgarly? Or should they be doing humanities but also learn the technical skills in case they want to bail out and get a job, things like that, right? What is the right way to do it? I have no idea. I think a way to sort of be in reality is to say they're going to do what they're going to do based on all sorts of factors I don't control. There should be useful, interesting stuff for them to learn wherever they are in the pipeline. It's actually a way we think a lot in the math department too. You're going to take calculus. You're either going to go get a PhD in math or you're not. Both of those are fantastic choices. Whatever you might do, it should be a good thing that you took calculus. And that's sort of how I think about this here as well. So for example, I would say maybe half the students on those projects would self-identify as I'm going to be a humanities major. And I should say almost all of them were either rising sophomores or rising juniors. So what they self-identified 3 months ago may not be what they self-identify now. So I'm talking 3 months ago. I think almost all the humanities students got technical skills they didn't have before. So that's something where we did a little bit of assessment. We essentially asked them beforehand, do you know what any of this stuff is? Have you done it? What are some examples? We asked them afterwards. The gradient was really high, things like that. I think the kids who maybe were more identified as STEM majors, they got a whole bunch out of it. The one thing they got actually was really, really interesting data, which essentially broke all the canned methods out there. There's this sort of algorithmic supremacy in the way people talk about topic modeling and machine learning. And they often say, here's a model, here's a method that takes a great big corpus of text and pulls out topics. And it works really, really well when you give it something super, super dry and boring. But when you give it Robinson Crusoe, it tends to break it. And that was really cool. It sort of broke the idea that there's nothing soft about the humanities input. I think I have a side rant about how soft skills I find to be one of the more insulting things that technical people ever say, right? Because that's actually what's hard. The other thing they learned, and that's a good segue, is that data science actually happens within a society, culture, and a world. So you're doing something technical, and that's about 1/100th of what's important. You also actually have to talk to the other people who are doing it. You have to understand something about how the data came to you, which could be just something as little as here's where the error is, but you might actually have to go have a conversation with the person who's giving you the data. You have to learn something about power dynamics, because the person you have to have a conversation with, you are not the boss of them. And so how do you get them to talk to you? What is useful? How do you tell them in a way that's respectful and maybe even truth adjacent that the way they gathered the data was not the best? That might be true, that might not be true. And so all of that is incredibly important and useful. I think something the grad students got out of it, and all these three of these grad students were going through PhD programs in humanities. In fact, all of them were in English department. For all of them, it was the first time that they had essentially been in charge, so to speak. So our attitude in Data Plus is that faculty are great as clients. They have really interesting problems, and they're really interested in what's going to happen. And it would not be a good idea for me to count on daily engagement from them. That's just reality. People go away for the summer, things like that. And so that's really what the project manager is for. So from my perspective, to the undergraduates, the graduate students are in charge, right? And they are working with the undergraduates to present something to the faculty member who's a client, right? And so let's clean things up and let's present it to Professor Sussman. Let's clean things up and present it to Professor Juni. And that was clearly the first time the graduate students had ever done anything like that. And what's interesting is that for almost all jobs you do that are not just tenure track position at R1 faculty member, very, very focused on research with no teaching, which I guess there are almost none of those, maybe IAS at Princeton, people want you to do that, right? At the company I'm at downtown, we want you to come in with a PhD and run a team of a bunch of 4 master's students and polish what they're doing and clean it up and make it presentable to our funders, right? And it's maybe not the best thing that that's not a large focus of PhD education, or even a small focus sometimes. And so they learned that. It was really important for them to have essentially the group therapy of having other people doing it as well, to sort of gossip about why isn't this working, come to me, ask for advice, things like that. So that was really useful. I think also they got the experience, honestly, of often when you were in a management position, you often have to actually understand and oversee work where you don't always understand it deeply on a technical level. That always happens, and yet you're the actual adult in the room and you actually know more. And somehow learning to navigate that. And that was really interesting. Let's see, what are the things to say? So you mentioned something about, in some sense, thinking of all these subjects as branches of the same tree. One thing that I found really, really interesting there was throughout all 3 of the projects, especially the Women's Space Project, but all of them, the concept of algorithmic bias came up. So in other words, right now we're in a position where everyone out there wants to sell algorithms that make decisions, to say whether or not you should get parole, to say whether or not you should get a bank loan, things like that. And boy, oh boy, is that a rabbit hole of horribleness. And what was really interesting from both sides is the STEM kids, maybe for the first time, learn that these problems exist. So they're introduced to the problem. That's really important. They got scared and they got annoyed. That's really important as well. The thing that was really fascinating that I hadn't really seen before is there were quite a few of the humanities students who came in knowing this, knowing how to say algorithmic bias, knowing how to say it existed, and that might be the only thing they know how to do about data science. And then they came in, and it was very important that they knew how to say that, but they didn't actually know how to do any of the algorithms. What was really interesting is when they came in and they were doing stuff, literally just labeling data. How do I code 17? How do I code Cosmopolitan Magazine? What do I actually do? It was very clear in their conversations. They were saying things like, wait, I'm not sure if I'm doing this the right way. Am I injecting my own bias? Am I doing this and am I doing that? And well, of course you are, right? That's the whole point. But it was very clear that they sort of went from perhaps a course perspective, that the way algorithmic bias happens is that people shake the algorithmic bias into the algorithm. And instead, they saw how it was happening. They saw they were who they were, which doesn't mean it's not a problem at all, but it made it much more complicated and more interesting. I think I guess two other observations is that, at least from my perspective, even though all of this stuff is so complicated, there's a huge value about throwing students in early and making them do stuff. Just come in, here's a problem, have at it, but have at it in kind of a controlled environment where lots of other people are doing this stuff and you're constantly having to talk about it. And I think there's often a hesitancy to do that because so many things are so scary from across the way. I think there's also a hesitancy to sort of do interdisciplinary work because it's actually an enormous amount of hard work up front, right? Like if you do interdisciplinary work where you basically have a working group and you meet twice a semester, you probably spend most of the time figuring out how to talk a common language, talking about what you should do, what would be a bad idea to do, and so on and so forth. And there really is something about this being 40 hours a week for 10 weeks of what students do. And you got to do something. This is kind of what they want at the end. And so you have to hash it all out. And so that was really useful. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay.
So our final set of prepared remarks are by
cool.
Priscilla Wald. Priscilla Wald is the R. Florence Brinkley Professor of English at Duke University. She received her PhD in English from Columbia University. Priscilla teaches and works on United States literature and culture, particularly literature of the late 18th to mid-20th century, contemporary narratives of science and medicine, science fiction literature and film, law and literature, and environmental studies. Her current work focuses on the intersections among law, literature, science, and medicine. Her last book-length study, Contagious: Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative, considers the intersection of medicine and myth in the idea of contagion and the evolution of the contemporary stories we tell about the global health problem of emerging infections. She is currently at work on a book-length study entitled Human Being After Genocide. This work chronicles the challenge to conceptions of human being that emerged from scientific and technological innovation in the wake of the Second World War, as well as post-war geopolitical transformations and decolonization movements. In her research, her teaching, and her professional activities, she is committed to promoting conversations among scholars from science, medicine, law, and cultural studies in order to facilitate a richer understanding of how information circulates through language, images, and stories to shape lived experience. Priscilla is currently Margaret Taylor Smith Director of the program in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies, and is on the Faculty Governance Committee of Science and Society and the Steering Committee of Information Science and Information Studies at Duke. So, thank you.
So I want to start by applauding this initiative. Can everyone hear me okay? By applauding this initiative, because from my experience, students really want these classes. And I know that from the students, they're looking for interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary classes and majors. I know it because they show up in my classes asking for it, my office, and I know it from my own children. And I think the reason is that the world's most pressing problems, they realize, require a multidisciplinary approach. And I'm thinking about some of the emerging new fields in environmental studies, peace studies, poverty studies, global health studies. Those are just some of the areas. So I'm going to share some of my own experiences teaching classes that I've learned a lot from, and then talk about the needs as you requested in the document, and my thoughts about assessment, how to assess this kind of class. But first, one dimension that's central for me but hard to articulate is I keep hearing that humanities teach us about critical thinking. And I'm not really sure what that means. I like to say it helps us see our blind spots. So you've mentioned I'm interested in how information circulates through language, image, and narrative. And I'll give you an example. How many of you remember GRID, what that was? GRID, G-R-I-D. Anyone? Gay-related immunodeficiency. It was the original name for HIV. And GRID is an excellent example of how language and narrative are technologies. Technologies help us see some things better, but they obscure other things. And in this case, a doctor hearing GRID, and GRID was only part of it. It was also the stories being told. So when a client walked in who was a gay man with certain symptoms, they would be more quickly diagnosed. That was the positive. On the other hand, when other clients walked in, there wasn't, say a woman walked in, people didn't suspect HIV. And most tragically, it wasn't suspected in the blood supply for a really long time because of the bias circulated with the language GRID. And one of the things I think the humanities can do is to help us analyze our language and our narratives and to see some of the biases and assumptions that we're bringing to our work. So when I see in your report all the different things that are useful for medicine, I would also say that the humanities can give better diagnostic skills because they can help somebody stand back and say, wait, I'm using this particular word over and over again. That means I'm thinking in a particular way. Maybe I need to think differently about this problem. And I tell that all the time to my students in the sciences when they're conducting experiments and things are going the same way and they can't figure out what's going wrong. I say, analyze how you're approaching this problem by looking at the language you're using to talk about it. And I had one student who was in my science fiction film class who was really resistant to this. And he asked me to have lunch to try to talk about it because he just didn't buy it. And by the end, I said, you don't have to buy it. This is my opinion. This is a theory. By the end of the lunch, he was a convert of some kind. And one of the most important, most amazing pieces of feedback I've ever gotten is a few years ago, he emailed me. He's in cancer biology at MIT getting a PhD. And he said that science fiction class was probably the most important class he had for the research that he's doing, or one of them. That was amazing to hear. So. I taught a class on science, law, and literature with Robert Cook-Deegan, who was here at the time, who is an MD and a public policy, master of public policy. And he was running the Center for Genome Ethics, Law, and Policy. And that center had done an amicus brief for something called the Myriad case, which was going through the Supreme Court. It was Myriad Genetics had patented genes, 2 genes, the genes that code for predisposition for breast cancer. And he had written an amicus brief in support of the ACLU, had brought a case, and he had written an amicus brief in support of the ACLU. And we decided to teach a class around this case. And one of the things that I think is really important is the need to understand deep cultural assumptions before we talk about ethics and policy. So ethics, and I can talk more about that. I heard a really interesting talk once by Leon Cass, who was then head of the President's Commission on Bioethics about cloning, where I feel that everything he said was sort of invalidated because he wasn't asking certain basic questions. So we need to look at these deep cultural assumptions. And what we started this class with was, first section, attitudes towards producing life in a lab. What have they been over time? We looked at Frankenstein, we looked at the island of Dr. Moreau, we looked at Boys from Brazil, and then we asked, and what do we mean by life? And we looked at Roe v. Wade. That was our first unit. And our goal was to understand the centrality of language and narrative to the law. So what are our assumptions about life produced in the lab? What do they tell us about our assumptions of life? And how can that help us understand some of the impasses of Roe v. Wade? And we asked our students to design a legal case from one of the literary works that we had studied. And then we went to a unit that had the assumption or the goal of helping our students see how language, images, and narratives are influencing the very framing of the questions that they were asking. And when we look at those things, what do they reveal, again, about our cultural assumptions? So we asked here, what does it mean to patent a life form? How are we talking about patenting a life form in legal cases, in science, in business? Why are people responding in the way they are? What are our assumptions about life that make us think in a particular way about patenting a life form? And we looked at a case of John Moore, whose cells had been patented, a cell line had been made from his cancerous cells. But we also looked at science fiction, Blade Runner, Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis books. And there our assignment was a literary critical reading of a legal case. And what we really wanted our students to see is how much was involved in a legal case, how much a legal case was about defining words and about telling stories, right? Finding a precedent and creating a narrative that linked that past event to the present. And one of our students, and this I thought was probably a positive outcome, realized that the law wasn't about finding truth about something, it was about making a particularly compelling argument, and she decided not to go to law school. That really troubled her. Another student in the class who had thought that he was going to med school decided to go to law school for that very reason. I don't know if they ever did these things, but that's what they told us. One of the important parts of this class was that Bob and I didn't split it up by expertise. Each of us had one class period that we ran every week about whatever the text was. So I talked about a legal case, he talked about a legal case. I talked about policy documents, he talked about policy documents. We both talked about film, we both talked about literature, and we wanted students to see how different people thinking differently approach these texts differently. The final section was on the Myriad case itself. We split into 3 groups. We had the very able assistance of Megan O'Neill, a wonderful, at that time, graduate student since PhD. And we each split up, and one group was the pro, one was the con, one was the judges. The pros and the cons had to argue the opposite of their case in writing, and the judges had to argue both cases in writing. And the final exam was that they had to try the case. And they had to include all of the analysis that we had taught them in this class. They had to talk about the assumptions about living organisms that were informing the case. They had to challenge them in some cases. They had to talk about what it would mean to patent life and why they thought it was or was not okay. And again, both sides had to argue the opposite, had to argue the opposite side in writing. Bob, who had taken a group of students, including one of my sons, to see the Supreme Court argue this case, pulled me aside in the middle of this trial and said, I can't believe it, they're better than the judges were. And I believe him. They were amazing. And it was amazing to watch students change their minds about what they thought they knew. But they really had to have all of these skills to do it. They had to understand the science, they had to understand something about the law and policy and the difference between them, and they really needed those cultural analytic or literary critical skills. It was amazing, amazing experience. Another class I've taught, I taught with, the first time I taught it with 4 people, Jed Purdy from the law school, Daniel Richter, who's a soil chemist from the Nicholas School of the Environment, Saskia Corns, who's the amazing head of runs the campus farm, also a PhD in English, and myself. And we were 4 people from not just different departments, different schools at Duke. And one of the things that was really important about this is we were all able to get full credit for this class. So 4 people were teaching this class. One of the things we felt was really important, and I feel is always really important, is that these classes be at least partly discussion-based. So the class I had with Bob was a seminar. This was a lecture class that had, I think, 45 students or 46-something students, and we broke into 4, oh no, wait, that time when we taught it, it was more than that. It was I don't know, 48 something, we broke into 4 small seminars. So Monday would be a lecture, so one of us would lecture, and Wednesday we broke into 4 separate seminars. And that's one of my takeaways, is how important it is that the university really devote resources to this and allow people to team teach and also give them classroom space. We scrambled to find those Wednesday spaces for our classes. And in this class, we looked at so students came in wanting to talk about environmental policy and wanting to think about environmental science, and we wanted them to see what underpinned, again, these debates. And we actually started in the Renaissance and looked at the changing concept of nature over time and how it underpins our cosmologies, the way we see the world, so that when we use the term environment or talk about the environment, talk about ecology and human-environment interactions, there is a whole set of assumptions behind that, a whole world view. And one of the things we wanted to show them is how difficult it is to talk across those assumptions and get people to see the world differently. So that was, you know, the big, one of the big important goals of that class. We also broke these students into small teams. And again, we had a lot of grad students working with us, and we could each mentor a 4 or 5 person group. And part of the impetus of this class was to get them to see the global and the local in relation to each other. So the class was looking at these big, broad issues over time, but we were very focused on how they developed and influenced the triangle area and the triad, the Piedmont area. So the students all had to do a group-based project, again, working across disciplines, having to negotiate the difficulty of talking across disciplines, and they had to do some local project that, again, we mentored them on. So people looked at 3 restaurants and how they were using local food and developed a rating for locavore cuisine. Students looked at gentrification, because again, all of this is part of the environment. Students looked at the food services at Duke and the economics of that and science and culture of that. So these were, again, all the problems or questions that the students brought. And the first thing we did was help them figure out as a group what their collective questions might be, right? Again, asking them to talk across disciplines, because out in the world, to solve any kind of problem, they're going to have to work with other people and talk across disciplines. And that was the most challenging thing for a lot of them to do, to come up with something they were all excited about, given their different majors and their different reasons for being in the class and their different training. So those are 2 examples. And to pull back, you know, so what are some of the needs? And that's one of the things the study asked. Again, they really ought to be team-taught classes, if you're going to be serious about it, where everyone teaches everything. You don't just drop in. Everybody's there for the full course, and everybody's teaching out of their comfort zone and struggling with the material, just as a lot of the students are struggling with the material. And that's really important for students to see me say to my colleague in science, I don't really understand what you mean there. We incorporated, I forgot to mention, the campus farm into our class. And so we went out to the farm, and Dan and Saskia would give lectures about how the farm was working, and Dan talked about the difference between history in a textbook and reading history in a soil. And I have no background in chemistry. So it was great for the students to be able to explain to me what he was talking about when I didn't understand it. You have to have assistants, you know, whether it's undergraduate TAs or graduate TAs, or, you know, you talked about this as well. You need a lot of people involved in these classes, and preferably at different levels, precisely because those different levels have different ways of communicating and different experience to bring, as you said. They have to be, I think, at least partly discussion-based. It's really, students get lost because they don't understand, and in many cases don't have experience with the disciplines that are getting crossed. and to be able to pick that up in the discussion before a student gets in trouble or frustrated or hopelessly disoriented. Some disorientation in a classroom is a great thing, but you don't want people getting too frustrated and you don't want to lose them. So having discussion, if it's a lecture-based, you need a small group. That means multiple people teaching it, and that means some help finding space on campuses. The question of the place in the university. Traditional departments don't always want scholars who themselves are crossing these disciplines. Innovative projects can make some faculty nervous, understandably, fair enough. Is my discipline, getting ignored? Is it going under? Are we not hiring in my discipline so that we can hire in this new thing I'm not sure I agree with or understand? So, faculty, the university administration really has to work with faculty to find places for these people, but also to reassure departments that that traditional knowledge is still valued. Assessment and training. Training graduate students, great. But the jobs and fields are often lagging behind the number of students who want this training. So figuring that out, which is sort of related to the point I just made, figuring out how to make those people legible in their own disciplines or in some discipline such that they don't come out so hybrid, again, there's no place for them. Again, related to the previous point. Evaluations, and this is my last point. I was very happy to see the term narrative evaluation. The evaluations that have gone numerical are a disaster, in my opinion, for all kinds of reasons, for diversity reasons, for diversity in terms of approach, this kind of innovative approach, where students can get disoriented, can get angry, can lash out. 5 years later, they come back and they say that course was amazing, but at the time, before they've gotten their grade, especially, they're frustrated and nervous. And I think seeing why a student didn't like a class is tremendously important, both for evaluation reasons and for a professor. Sometimes we didn't do our job well enough explaining what we were doing. Other times, and I saw this recently in an evaluation in the department that I chair, where a student said, well, if you're interested in GSF, gender, sexuality, and feminist studies, and science, then this class will be interesting, but I'm not, and I don't think students should take this class if they're not interested in GSF. Well, duh, it's a GSF class. So, so if the numbers are low, you need to see why. And frequently when there are numbers, students fill out the numbers and they don't, no matter how much you beg, write the evaluations. So I always design my own evaluations. They are handed out in class because I've tried this. When students sit there with computers and I say, please fill out the evaluations, they write their sentence, they leave. When they're sitting there with a series of questions that I have asked that are specific to this course and how it was taught, information I need, they sit there and they write full paragraphs and more. And when they can see the blank space and they're writing in it, they see what they have and haven't written. One sentence doesn't look like enough. They write much more fulsome evaluations. I know that's more labor intensive, but if we're serious about assessment and evaluation, to me, this is the way to go. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to everyone. And before I turn things over to your questions, I actually what I have is really just more of a comment to start. I particularly, we gave very broad parameters, for comments. We didn't dictate in what direction you go in, but I like particularly Priscilla and Paul, how your comments really complemented each other well. Because although Paul also teaches and classes, he has chosen to focus on the co-curricular Data Plus program. And Priscilla, even though I know that you have been a Bass Connections faculty client, you have chosen to talk about teaching, and I think that underscores an important distinction made very early in the report, is that they're talking about both curricular and co-curricular methods for integrating. So I think that's important, and I do myself have larger questions about which is harder or which is easier, or maybe they're both hard. But I feel like I'd be remiss if we didn't at least acknowledge that we also have a program at Duke called Bass Connections, which is, I think it's fair to say it's broader than Data Plus, even though Data Plus is broad, because it's not just data driven, it's much broader topics that are interdisciplinary in scope, and again, there's a team structure with faculty and grad students. And so, but that's another means in which, we can further integrate the higher education experience. So I just wanted to mention
You know, it's
that.
interesting because I would say that my experience in Vast Connections so far is that it's much easier to do the integration of the humanities and the science, at least as I have found, in a classroom than it is in the setting of a Vast Connections where students are on their own doing projects and you can give them assignments and you can give them reading and you can give them lectures, but they're going to go the way they're going to go with the assignment. And I think one of the things we're working on is how to change our assignments so that it really demands that they do the more integrated thing. But my classrooms have done, I have found it easier to do this integration.
Yeah, I think that resonates a lot with my experience, where I have found that the reason Data Plus works, in the sense that it does work, is that we have the students locked in the building for 40 hours a week for 10 weeks. We really do. That's what they're doing. We sort of control their experience. And I think exactly that. If you have an independent research project where they sort of go off and maybe they come back, it's very easy for you to go down blind alleys. I think a thing that's worked well, it's the second year we've done this sort of controlled experiment, is we've had quite a few Vast Connections teams that have kicked off with a Data Plus team. So you do Data Plus over the summer, you do an intense amount of work, you figure out what your questions are, you go down blind alleys, you kind of figure out what your strengths are and what you want to do, and then you go do Vast stuff. And so in then some sense, you've got a kickstart. I think those are working well.
That's interesting.
But,
yeah.
you know, n equals 5. So.
Yeah.
Great. So, so let's take some questions.
I'd like to go off on the Maria's point that she started on. I was thinking this too, especially even at the outset when Pamela was reading through some of her comments. I think at Duke we do a good job. There's sort of a known idea here at Duke that there's sort of a shadow curriculum, right? Like we have Vast Connections, we have Data Plus, we have all this great stuff, and it's part of the experience of being at a place like Duke that the students have a lot of great opportunities to do things in the co-curricular space. And so I'd like to hear a few more comments maybe about whether the ultimate goal here is that we really get this integration done in the curriculum in 4-credit courses, or do we keep just pouring into doing the co-curricular because it is enriching people here, but it seems like, to Paul's point when he started, not everyone has the same opportunities as a place like Duke. So bigger picture, are we trying to find solutions where things could actually be part of the curriculum, or are we looking at just doing richer things in the co-curricular space to really bring this to the front?
I mean, to wear my politics entirely on my sleeve, I think the answer is both, and more money should be spent on it rather than less. I think I think one of the ways in which people often talk about innovation education and Coursera and so on, there's this stingy undercurrent where the point of it is to replace classroom experiences and sort of make something that's clearly not as good. And I think instead it can enrich things, but obviously it should be more resources, right? I mean, I think your point is 100% correct that lots of contact is really important, lots of discussion, lots of faculty. And the thing that resonated to me, which was really striking, is everything you were saying about what was needed for an interdisciplinary class is also needed for teaching Calculus 1, right? If I just talk and students don't understand the first thing that happened, they're going to shut down. So I need to stop talking and we need to work in small groups, which means to mean there needs to be one of me for every 20 students, right? And that's just true across the board. And I think so I think there isn't, politics underlies all of it. And so I think like as you develop co-curricular, as you develop curricular, the idea has to be that they have to help each other, and it has to be a way so that there's more money spent on it.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a fantasy knowing nothing about organic chemistry, so this could be completely, but I once had, nuts, but I once had a discussion with somebody about organic chemistry and all the people who fail organic chemistry because they're so anxious about it and they just come in already scared and they just, can't think through the class. When I was growing up, my best friend wanted to be a doctor and she kept failing organic chemistry and decided she wasn't going to be a doctor. She really loved politics, and she got an A in organic chemistry that year, that semester. When she stopped being afraid. Seriously, or maybe it was a B+. But anyway, she did well. But so I wondered, what if you had a small section of organic chemistry and you taught it in terms of the history of its emergence as a concept. So, you know, would students who could put the emerging ideas and concepts of organic chemistry in relation, say, to art movements at that moment, or what's happening historically, or something that they felt more, you know, comfortable with, that wasn't so terrifying, could we broaden the number of students, not necessarily pre-meds, right? The number of students who might want to take organic chemistry because it's interesting conceptually if you put it in dialogue with these other things. So I deeply feel that crossing disciplines can allow you to teach concepts generally more effectively and make them more accessible in a classroom. But this may be completely nuts, and people who actually know the field might say that's not possible. I don't know. It's a fantasy.
Well, I think too, just to add one more layer to the curricular versus co-curricular question is, you know, this question, my question is inflected by my work with graduate students. So I advise doctoral students in the humanities and humanistic social sciences, and I have many conversations with students trying to encourage them to broaden, because as I'm sure many of you know, you get a PhD in philosophy or classics. I mean, you're going to be very, very, very focused by year 6 or 7, and there are definitely tensions, right? I have students coming and saying, well, you know, I'm not sure my advisor is going to buy this, or I've been told this is a waste of time, I can't do this. So I think we have increasing numbers of students who do these programs despite everything and really have great things to report. But that said, you know, it seems to me like, okay, well, we see some promise for doctoral education in the humanities with co-curricular integration projects, and also it seems like, as you mentioned, students who help to teach or co-teach these integrated courses develop amazing teacher training. Yet it seems to me that there are some real limitations when we think about, well, can we actually integrate a doctoral curriculum? I know the report did mention some new integrated PhD programs that I think at Arizona State, yet, you know, as you mentioned, there's so many things to consider, including job markets.
We have one here. I mean, my son is a graduate student in computational media arts and culture here.
Yeah.
And that is a technology, arts, humanities program that is training students in both of these areas.
Right, so
Where
I
are
mean,
the jobs? We'll see.
yeah, I mean, to build on that, I mean, I think there's 2 different kind of trajectories that we can look at this larger phenomenon. One is, okay, how do we apply it in our institutions? How do we teach it? How do we co-teach it? How do we make sure we have the right resources, et cetera? Very important questions. The other level is perhaps in the other direction of saying, what is the overall impact that can happen in terms of not only education, but our culture and society as a whole, and we start to think more in terms of the integrative direction. So listening into your descriptions of both of your classes and your work, I'm like, man, I want to take those classes. they sound great. But some thoughts that were coming to mind was that, and you spoke to this a bit, it's about the grappling, and I'm going to say the epistemological stance that our disciplines are situated in. Right, and it's actually asking not only students but our colleagues as well to sit there and say, okay, how do we come to understand what we understand, right? And where do those things actually rub up against each other, ride with each other, kind of like bounce off of each other, so that we can have even a larger or more cohesive, or whatever the word is, way of understanding a certain phenomenon. So then you talk about your students, you thought they were going to be medical students, went to law school, and they end up going to medicine. It's in the report, and it's, I think, also within our kind of discussion of, in general, not just this room, of this notion of integration, of saying, okay, so where are the jobs? I would say that that's actually a false argument, because in essence, when we're looking at integration across the disciplines, which is not meaning getting rid of disciplines, but at least seeing where they come and intertwine, I think that we're actually creating the next generation of thinkers. And I think that if you were to look at, if there was ever a study to look at who the leaders are, whether it's industry, whether it's government, policy, education, etc., then most likely they come from a perspective that's more about integration across the disciplines. As a matter of fact, they might be themselves polymaths.
Oh,
right?
I agree.
So yeah, so if we're looking at the overall picture of where the potentials for careers are, and I think we all know as educators, we don't know what that is because it will change tomorrow and it will change in 5 years, etc. We're basically educating the next generations going into those paths to be able to rise to the top in those paths because they've been taught to think much broader than any one specific epistemological kind of like viewpoint or focus in a specific discipline.
I agree with you on undergrad. I was more concerned with graduate students, and I think you're absolutely right if you're thinking about graduate students who may or may not want to go on and be academics. But if I am, you know, and I do train students who have these projects that don't always look legible within the fields that English departments are hiring in. And that's what I'm talking about.
So I would argue that those fields are going to start to evolve as well.
They will.
You know, so disciplines,
But after these students.
you know, often you have interdisciplinarity because people come together because they don't have a place or home, and they end up forming new disciplines. So human-computer interaction and human-centered computing is an example of that. You have people who are coming from computer science design and behavioral sciences who had a synergy in the way they wanted to think and needed to find someplace to find. But if you look at HCI or HCC or whatever you want to call it now, it is actually a discipline. So that's like a new young discipline that evolved out of the fact that people came together.
But they had to
you know,
get the
within
jobs
that.
in the first place.
Well, they had to make the jobs. So, you know, I won't go deeper into my own profile, but I would call myself someone who's made that path. You know, if you look at the path of my degrees and what I've studied, it's not like I said, okay, I want to study A, and I stuck with that all the way through, right? But those paths, and perhaps I just lucked out, but you know, that path has led to the places that I've been able to be. So, for example, to be a rotator at the National Science Foundation, most people say, well, did you study computer science and engineering? No. You know, but the path still led to that, right? Yeah.
So, I mean, one thing to really think about, if we're thinking really about graduate students and their trajectories, is that what a lot of this conversation is coming around to me is that there's one particular, and I think fairly toxic way that some faculty think of the trajectory of a good graduate student, which is that this is my graduate student. It is my job to determine whether he or she is to be considered intelligent. And if he or she is to be considered intelligent, she is going to get an academic job within my tribe. And if she's not to be considered intelligent, then that's a failure, and then she's going to, he or she is going to go do something else, right? In mathematics, you hear this all the time, right? It's like, oh, yeah, this is a good enough dissertation for industry, I guess, right? Even though, frankly, so many really interesting questions happen at my company, right? And I think that leads to so many problems, right? It leads to a lot of the abuses we see that are coming out, where it's just if one person is the gatekeeper, boy, oh boy, is that a lot of power. And it also just leads to the fact that, well, if what they wanted you to do, if they made the wrong gamble and that's not what's going to get you a job, and that was all you were focused on, that's really debilitating, that's really traumatic, and it also, you didn't get there, right? And so I think one of the things that I think is really, really interesting is just when, and I think a lot of interdisciplinary work and a lot of data science work and a lot of academic industry collaboration can have the potential to be fairly disruptive in, is okay, you're going to do that, you're going to do really good work in a dissertation, and also there are people other than your advisor whose job it is to determine whether or not you're smart, right? And that's, you could go this way, you could go, it's the same thing with these undergraduates, right? Like however you got there, whether you humanities or a STEM major, you're going to go on the path you're going to do, and you could go this way, you could go this way, you could still get something good out of it, you could still go this way, and so on. I think that's maybe what you're raising, right? Like that's, I mean, what's funny, even narrowly within just machine learning, which I'm going to maintain is interdisciplinary within itself, you know, we have people we hire at the company with master's degrees or PhDs, and if they've heard what machine learning or deep learning is from a mathematician and from a statistician and from a data cleaning person and from an engineer and maybe someone in the discipline they're doing the deep learning at, I am much, much more impressed with their abilities than if they've just heard it from one of them, right? That's what you were saying before. It was good to see that in conversation. And so I think a way to conceptualize all this, and I think it's really, really hard political work, right? Because there's the world we're looking for. You know, we want these jobs to exist, and then there's what we have now. I think a really good way to sort of be as safe as possible maybe is just
build in these skills to what you're doing in the training and recognize that since you can't predict where they're going to go, there always should be good things that come out of every possible thing. Like that's it's like what you said about making your own trajectory, that resonates emphatically with me, right? Like somehow the reason I have these 3 random titles, which somehow add up to a well-compensated faculty position, is mostly a miracle, right? So, like,
And it seems to me that, just to hear you talk, I mean, I think along with integrating the curriculum, I think we have to continue to work with, I think, both undergraduates and graduates into perceiving a much greater fluidity of trajectories, you know, such as what Pamela described. You know, just sort of anecdotally, with our program, with our advising, we resist, there's certain language we never ever use. Like, we never use plan A versus plan B with doctoral students ever. We don't use the phrase alt-ac. I mean, I'm saying it now, but I have to go wash out my mouth with soap after I say it. I mean, because it implies binaries, it implies 2 tracks, and we really want to get students out of thinking like that. So anyway, you had your hand.
Going back to the curricular issue, and I hope a question comes out of this. I teach at one of the premier STEM high schools in the country, right down the street here, and we're also blessed with a world-class humanities department, and we had an opportunity last year to do some course innovation work. A colleague and I in humanities proposed, I'm a computational chemist, we proposed a course in the digital humanities, and it's like anytime you submit a proposal, be careful what you ask for because you might get it. Administration approved it. So I spent all day at the Humanities Center in the park at a conference called Digital Humanities Nuts and Bolts. I didn't hear a lot of nuts and bolts. Good conference, but I didn't hear a lot. So the question I have in terms of breaking silos and turf at a university is bad. Worse at a high school. So the fact that we got this course approved is a big deal. So the question now that my colleague and I are facing is, how do we operationalize this? How do we, we asked for it, we got it, now we've got to do it. So I wrote down almost everything you said about the discussions and the team teaching and all that. So I guess the question is, okay, now that, if you buy into this integration between STEM and humanities, where are the roadmaps for integrating, for actually doing that at some level, and are there any? And what do you include? Do you focus on the skills? Do you focus on? So we're very much grappling right now with, and it's our students that are going to come here.
Right.
So we're anxious that they're coming to you prepared. So I hope there's a question in there.
So I think that, one of the things that we found in the study is that there aren't any roadmaps. Right. So in many ways, if you're going to work on the metaphor, you're building the bridge as you walk on it. Or as a colleague of mine said, you're riding the train and laying the tracks. Right. So I'm not saying that there aren't other programs that have done similar things of what your class will be doing. And I'm sure that all of us do our research and try to find out what else is happening and benchmarking, et cetera. What we found in the study was a lot of kind of more narrative-based or anecdotal in terms of the importance of doing this type of work. Although I think we're sitting in a room probably of true believers, and I think there's many more, So it's really about, now that you have the opportunity, what are the next steps that you and your colleagues do to actually start to notate, assess, disseminate the results of it, so that we can start to build more of that information.
I think
I have something pragmatic, but go ahead.
But actually, maybe this is also one piece of maybe meta advice on the pragmatic level is that in some sense you're trying to start something from the ground up and you want it to be bigger than just you. And so I think one way to go about it, which has never been the way I want to do it, is just do your best to get absolutely all the important people in the room, work out the scheduling problem, 3 months later get them in the room and have a long discussion about what you're going to do. I think another way to do it, which is a way I've always pursued it and I think works well often, is just get together with people whose ideas you've developed it with. Do something, but kind of do that with the idea that we're doing an example, we're doing a prototype, and try your do best to sort of make it impressive and rapidly bring more people in. So in other words, with Data Plus, it was always, okay, we start with 5 projects, but showing the students how the sausage is made. You know, in week 6, you've done something really interesting, very explicitly. You've done something really interesting. I think that would convince this vice provost to fund more work like this. You're going to go talk to her next week. Prepare these slides, let's go do that. Like, go make the pitch, right? And so I think the more sort of explicitly mercenary you are about that, is that the point of this is to make it bigger, then I think the more it's easy to just focus on it. Like, I'm doing this so that it can become bigger, and this is what it would look like.
I have a different approach, and I don't know if it would work in high school, because I've done something like this in college, but it depends on, I know your students are excellent, so I think it would probably work there too. And that's to get the students in the room who are interested, offer it as a class, and say to the students, this class is about developing a class in digital humanities. And then, to me, the first question I ask everybody on day 1, what brought you here? What are your questions? What are you trying to answer? And not just in this class, but what are your big questions? When you think metaphysically, and whatever word you want to use there, when you're just sort of walking around thinking about the world, what do you want to understand about the world? And how did those questions get you to this classroom? And when people understand their questions, the next step is, okay, so where's the intersection? And how do we start building something that will begin to address this series of questions? Because some of them will converge, some of them won't. You'll have a series of questions. And then you see, and everybody's invested in figuring out what the next year's class will be.
Yeah, I think actually, I mean, something I've noticed a lot with talking to students at Duke, and exactly, I think students, proto-students at Duke and students at elite universities, which is where you're coming from, is that a type of academic capital we all have and they don't, is they may well be good at doing something in a class, but then they get to a question the class doesn't cover. We're really good at saying, we're not going to cover that, but that's a chemistry question. It's really interesting. Here's how you set it up. Here's how you go. So for example, I teach a course which is essentially the mathematics behind a lot of machine learning stuff. Often I'll get to the point where, like, okay, I've shown you this can be computed, and that's a good idea to compute it. Lots of computer scientists think very deeply about how to compute it efficiently. Let's name the problem. Let's write a course number on the board. Let's point you in that direction. You know, I can say, okay, here's a bunch of work. Now at this point, it's probably chemistry, which means I can't do it, but probably you can, right? And sort of pitch it that way. And so somehow, even if you don't feel have to have the responsibility to cover everything, but just somehow naming problems you're not covering and introducing to them those problems and pointing them in that direction, right? Like that's.
Thank you.
There's a question all the way back there. Yes.
What experience have any of you had with incorporating companies or venture capitalists or anybody into your courses, or at least considering the idea as far as, that providing a career look for some of the students?
So for Data Plus, right, to pay each student $5K, and there's 70 students in the program, plus food, plus we have to do the mentors, it's about $450K. Probably about $150 of that each summer comes from industry sponsors. And that's a really interesting conversation, right? That's essentially, you get them to sponsor a project, you have to think enormously about intellectual property and the fact that you are not developing it, right? But you are helping them explore ideas, you're helping them explore what the workforce looks like. And in many ways, you're sort of selling ideas to them. And that's got a huge number of benefits, and also not, right? I mean, it also gets to the fact that I don't know how many different senior vice presidents of digital strategy know buzzwords and nothing else. And so you call everything deep learning when in fact it isn't, right? And so, I guess I'm live, aren't I?
Okay.
Yeah.
Tell the truth.
Tell the truth, yeah.
So I've had some experiences of weaving those layers in and out. And research that started in academia, then went into the private sector, and then back into academia. Both with federal funding, then also working with outside corporations, whether they're supporting the work in various ways. And at each stop, whether it was actually the projects that I've worked on have been situated in the university or outside the university, I've always brought students in through whatever network. So if I didn't have a network directly into a university, meaning I taught at that university, I still found ways to collaborate and to find and talk to other colleagues to do that, to bring students into that. I think it's a really interesting learning experience. So for example, the research that I've been working on, at times I've had professional industrial product designers, electrical engineers, and then students who are learning industrial design or computer science at various levels who are also part of the making and the dialogue. Depending on where their skills were, they were either more involved in the making, or I think it's really important for the self-efficacy, because we're talking about institutions, whether it's Duke or the high school, students who have a pretty high level of self-efficacy. But sometimes I think it's important also to bring in students who aren't, of the background, the opportunity, or the experience necessarily to be able to actually engage in certain levels of conversation on a research project or a creative project or a humanities project, but just by the very nature of them being there and listening to their peers, that it can be life-changing for them. So at any level, that happens. Now, when you're talking about venture capitalists or anything like that, you're dealing with the money side as well. If you're working with students, most institutions I've been part of, you kind of have to separate those, right? So it's not necessarily the students coming into work on something that's VC funded, if I were to be so lucky. But let's say there are some things that have been funded that weren't necessarily in the university setting. It really has to be separated in terms of what their role and responsibilities are versus the bigger picture of the actual projects that they're working on.
I think just an example of, I think, a really positive thing that's often come out with Data Plus industry interactions for the students is we'll have projects where essentially the reason why the company decided we want you to study this is probably, there's someone high up in the company who wants to say, I'm doing something with Duke. Then there's someone in the company, sort of much more lower level technical nerd in some department, who really wants to study topic A, and the company has never paid him or her to do it, because there's no obvious profit, it's not within the workflow. So they're really interested and invested, but they don't have the time to do it. And so they're the actual client. And so that's really interesting to sort of see the students interact with. This is a person who's really interested in this, has some conception of what should happen, which is either right or not. How do you work with that? And then we've had examples where they've immediately shown them really good stuff. We've had wonderful examples from last summer where they sort of pretty quickly say, your hypothesis here wasn't correct. And then they have to figure out how to navigate that. In some sense, in many ways, they have to figure out that what they're really trying to do here is to deliver to that person ammunition to show their boss, no, we really should look into this, right? We should spend more money than you thought we should to study this, because look, there's gold here, right? And that's invaluable, right? That's a lot of what you do in the world, is sort of do lots of work, which was based on someone else's idea, but they're not doing the work, and figuring out how you navigate that. So.
I think we have time for one more question. Okay, so all the way in the back there. I'm sorry, you just stand up first.
Yeah, I'm sorry. This is kind of off in a different direction, but I'm fascinated myself in this concept of intellectual property and how we take information and then claim ownership of it. Coming from a visual arts background, but also someone who does a lot of engineering in terms of my practice, I wonder how the panel, how you see intellectual property versus, like public domain patents, things like this, these sort of issues of intellectual property, how they might relate into this sort of cross-disciplinary, I don't know, new discipline sort of approach.
Well, I think it's an interesting question. I mean, you have the range from copyleft to copyright to, IP, as our universities support us across various IP issues. If we're looking at like the creative technology side in terms of integration, I think there's been a lot of interesting discoveries, progress, creativity that's happened because of open source, right? Because the tools, well, I think there's a couple of things happening. You have open source, the tools are becoming more available, as well as you're getting more people making those tools have had an integrative education and realize that they are not the only users of those tools. So those tools are usable by more people. So whether we're talking about Arduino or whatever, so the open source is playing a very important role. But once again, Arduino is a microcontroller processor used in physical computing. If if you look at that, they kind of have like a split model. They're open source, right? But then you can look at their plan and make your own board and sell it, make money off of it, right? So it's not like an either or, you know, type of world, and a lot is on the technical side in terms of the open source side. As a visual artist, you know, and I can relate to that as well because I wear that hat too. IP is always a very interesting issue, you know. Copyright, we always have copyright, right? IP comes into play when there's a potential of monetizing what you're making, right? So that's where copyright, I think, and IP kind of like start to go down different paths. So IP is often not necessarily an issue unless you're trying to monetize. As a visual artist, often we might, going back to your question about kind of collaborating with corporations or VCs or et cetera, someone might see something that we might see on the visual side or the art side as copywriting, but they're interested in it, then we have to deal with our background IP, right? So for example, I've worked with designers in other positions where I was doing more professional development who were doing amazing work, and then all of a sudden a large corporation is interested in their designs, right? So how are they protecting what we've always called copyright, because it's their creative work, in terms of then having a conversation with a Fortune 500 corporation where they want that relationship, right? But have they protected their background IP? In other words, is that corporation interested in because they've made that little squiggly line, and the next thing you know, they're going to use that squiggly line and not actually then bring anything back to the artist who originally created that squiggly line. I'm not talking about any specific corporation in this case. So, yeah, I think there's a continuum in the way that we think about that, and depending upon where you stand philosophically on it, you know, then you find that point, you know, that continuum, you know, or that span of points.
I'd add to philosophical, conceptual, and one of the things, I mean, I'm not involved at the level, I don't deal with the businesses, it's all conceptual with me, but one of the things that our Bob in my class was about and that I have written about is the concept that underpins, or the set of assumptions that underpin patents, among which is that altruism wouldn't motivate us. Things like that, curiosity wouldn't motivate us. So I'm really interested, and I get a lot of resistance from some people. I've given this talk a number of times at medical schools about, you know, sort of challenging on some level the assumption that we absolutely have to have patents and we can't imagine a world without them. And I get some people, you know, I remember walking out behind one man who said, well, nice talk, but she's so naive. You know, and that's true. But at the same time, I've had people run up and say, oh my God, I've been saying this for years. Thank you so much for giving me that language. So I think it's the unthinkable in our world right now. And it's worth thinking about what would happen if we did away at least with some patents in some areas where they are really actually impeding research, which I think you're getting at as well.
So, unfortunately, we are past time, so we're going to have to end here. But thank you again so much, Pamela, Priscilla, and Paul.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.